As a small business owner, just how many LLCs do you need? Let's talk about it. Even inside the law, there's differing opinions of just how many legal entities you need in order to make your business successful and to properly protect it. And so if you think about the spectrum where somebody might say you need just one LLC versus you need dozens, I probably fall somewhere in the middle because there's different situations for different people. And I probably fall more towards this side because of practical components. So the first thing to think about is every single LLC is kind of like a bucket. That's where you keep your assets and your liabilities relating to your business. And if you have a particular liability that is particularly toxic, then you don't want that muddying up assets in someplace else that may not necessarily have those same risk parameters. So the classic scenario is if I run a trucking brokerage company, but I also own my own trucks. That's a fantastic situation to put two separate LLCs. You've got the side that runs the brokerage, but you've also got the actual trucks. And the trucking liability could end up blowing up your brokerage business fairly easily, whereas it's easy to keep a very clear line, to keep those in two separate buckets so that the toxic liabilities in a trucking accident or something like that doesn't bleed over into your brokerage. If there's a lawsuit against one, then it doesn't necessarily affect the other. So that is the big picture to think about. But for most businesses, you'll need just one LLC. For other LLCs, though, you might have some more complex setups. For instance, the most complex client we've ever worked with had roughly 4 dozen different LLCs. And the reason for that is that there was legitimate reasons to keep every single one of those assets and liabilities separate. But there's another component to that a lot of people don't tell you about, is that you've got to think about each individual LLC as being a separate company. It's a separate bucket. It's a different activity that has to have recordings every single time that there's transactions between those LLCs. So let's talk about a very simple situation. Say, for instance, I own a residential real estate investment business, and I own 3 properties, all under one LLC. That's perfectly acceptable. As long as you're well insured, you don't necessarily have to have different pieces of properties in different LLCs. Now, the problem that arises a lot of times is that in a scenario like that where I just have one LLC and 3 different properties, in a worst case scenario, if somebody has a slip and fall at one property and I don't have enough insurance to cover that, then they can go against the other properties in order to get full recovery for whatever their damages are. That's a worst case scenario. However, that is very, very rare. If it does happen, it's catastrophic, obviously, but that does not happen as often as other situations. Say, for instance, I have that same setup, and then we have a different setup, which is 3 LLCs, one LLC to hold each individual piece of real property, and then a holding company over the top. Now, think about this. Let's say, for instance, that I have a piece of property that is currently rented out, and it's making a lot of money. But then I have another piece of property that needs to have repairs done to it. However, it has not been rented in a long period of time, and that LLC in its bank account doesn't have any cash. Now, if I have one LLC that sits over everything, I can easily take the money that this property is generating and contribute it towards the repairs that are in this property. However, if I have that 4 LLC setup that I was just talking about with multiple layers, then now what I have to do is I have to take this profitable LLC. I have to either loan this money, and that needs to be documented in a recording promissory note with an interest rate and payment terms to the LLC that has not been profitable. Then that LLC has to promise to pay that money back, which is fine because that does protect you in those situations. But if that transfer is not recorded, if you just took water from this bucket and put it into this bucket and had no record of that water being transferred back and forth, that gives a basis for what we call piercing the corporate veil. That allows for somebody else to say, hey, listen, these aren't 4 different LLCs, they're one LLC. And so they're all going to be treated the same as far as the liability purposes. And the reason that can create a lot of problems is because if you only have insurance on this property or only have insurance on this property, the insurance company may very well say, we're not covering that liability. We don't insure this property. We only insure this property. And so now you've got a situation where because you haven't actually taken the steps to keep these different LLCs separate, you've actually exposed yourself to liability. So to bring back to the original question, it always depends on what your structure is and what your strategy is on just how many LLCs that you need. And so it's very hard for me as an attorney to say that there's a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter solution for every single business. And this is why you need to consult with an attorney to figure out what works best for you. Because in a situation where you say, hey, listen, I don't need to deal with all that bookkeeping and paperwork to keep all these different LLCs separate, recording checks and transactions from one, loan or promissory notes or payments back from the other, and dealing with all that stuff. In that scenario, it's going to be best for you to say, hey, listen, let's just put this under one big umbrella and get good insurance. But let's say, for instance, we're a large company. We have full-time bookkeepers on staff that this is what they do already. And so for them to add on a few transactions a week to make sure that we're properly recording these transactions so that we can get the protection between these different companies, that's a no-brainer. If I'm a company like GE where I've got different individual areas and practice areas or business areas, and every single one of these have different liabilities, different ownership, different management. All of those are legitimate reasons to keep that separated. So, as I mentioned, ownership, that's typically one of the biggest areas that I recommend setting up different LLCs. It's real easy if I'm a single owner to say, hey, listen, I can have as many LLCs as I want, or as few as LLCs as that I want. But if I have a lot of different owners and different ownership structures, like, oh yeah, for this particular business, it's 100% me. But on this particular business, it's 50-50 with another partner. But on this business, I might be 10% and there might be two other partners inside the business splitting the remaining 90%. That is a classic scenario for why you need to set up different LLCs for those businesses, because setting up separate ownership structures are very important. Not just so that you know how much ownership that you have in this company, but it's very important that they know that they don't have ownership in the other companies. So for instance, if I have 123 Baker Street and then 456 Smith Street, and I'm 50-50 with another partner, they know or should know that I have this other company with other properties that's separate from that activity. They should know that they have no interest in the other businesses that I have affiliated with. Of course, now that creates other problems because you have a fiduciary duty as an owner and an operator of these companies potentially, and that could expose you to liability. So I have different ownership structures. Say, for instance, I got a really, really good deal on lumber on this particular property, and I don't let the other companies know about that. Is that a breach of fiduciary duty? If I'm loaning money from one company to the next, are those terms fair? Have I properly disclosed potential conflicts of interest? So this is why it's very important to work with an attorney when you're setting up these business structures, because, yeah, from a pure legal standpoint, I would say, yeah, every single business that has differing liabilities and different concerns needs to set up different LLCs for every single part of its business practices. But from a practical standpoint, I know how people operate. I run into businesses all the time that they don't separate bank accounts, they don't keep separate checkbooks, they don't keep separate records. And if you're not diligent about doing that, if you're not diligent about recording those transactions and keeping everything separate, then the practical reality is that you could be exposing yourself to liability that you would not be exposed to had you been operating your business somewhere else. So there's always that tension between what legally is appropriate and then what I know people are going to do practically. So that's why when I'm working with my clients, I often tailor that advice to say, hey, listen, are you really going to take the time to keep these transactions separate? Would you be better served by just having a good insurance policy? Or these are truly different businesses. They have different risk profiles. They have different business operations and ownership. And we need to make sure that this is kept separate from this so that nobody has disparate expectations between these different business areas. So these are all things to factor in if you're trying to consider just how many LLCs that your small business needs. Again, more often than not, you're going to lean towards the side of not having that many LLCs. But there are certain situations that do justify having very complex business structures. And so it's important to work with an attorney and to ask them questions about, hey, listen, when I'm going through this process, how many LLCs do I need? This is how I practically operate. I don't have a full-time bookkeeper on staff, or I'm more than happy to pay for an outsourced bookkeeper, or hey, we already have somebody internally that's doing this already, so for us to add on another LLC that's going to have a couple of transactions a year is very easy for us to do. So in those situations, we've got to factor in all those different factors in weighing whether or not we have a complex business structure or a fairly simple business structure. So when you're going to talk to an attorney, here's the things to ask. First is generally, how many LLCs do I need? Secondly, weigh how you're currently operating. So figure out whether or not you're able to practically handle separate LLCs. 3, see if you're adequately insured to see if the insurance covers what you've currently got going on. And then 4, if you have different ownership structures, making sure that there are separate LLCs or different agreements to handle those different business operations. And then 5, if you have substantially different risk profiles between those companies, ask your attorney to weigh those risk profiles on whether it's worthwhile to keep those businesses separate or whether it's sufficient to keep them under one umbrella. So these are all things to factor in when you're trying to decide how your business should be structured. But again, this is generalized advice. You should always run this by an attorney, but this should give you some good questions to ask when you go into your attorney meeting. So, my name is Tripp Watson. I'm with the Watson firm. We are based out of Birmingham, Alabama. If we can help you with your business structure and help you get set up with how many LLCs that your business needs or consult with you on that, I hope that you'll reach out to us. Our contact information is included in our bio. And we hope that you'll like and subscribe to our video feeds. Thanks.